Mech pilots, online. BattleTech manuals, online. Long-term memory, offline. All systems bungled. Initiating BungleTech podcast.
In our 30th deployment, my spheroid self Michael will be running the show because my clanner co-host Nathan is away this month. But fortunately, I'm joined by our friend and frequent opponent, Paul, a talented and well-traveled demo agent who knows a thing or two about what it's like bringing new players into the game, and more importantly, what kind of bungles they make. Paul also shares with us a story of extremely rapid immolation on the battlefield, and I will read a clip from the coolest mech jockey in the Old West. So strap yourself in and brace against the bulkheads, MechWarriors, as I stumble through commanding my very own deployment of BungleTech.
Bonus objective. Extraordinary proclamation. Initiating.
Clan Kodama, I greet you on this most unusual of episodes, a lowly professor here to share word of our clan's great exploits and newest members. As many of you have noticed, our beacon, our leader, our spiritual guide Nathan has been absent. Be assured that he is safe, most likely, and will return soon, we desperately hope. But for now, he remains on a secret mission of the utmost importance. Now, though we may be leaderless temporarily, we have not completely fallen to chaos and despair, and we remain strong, as Nathan would have wished us to be. Joining our mighty and not at all frantic clan is the master craftsperson, Technician Keflin. Their skill in the art of mech maintenance is peerless, and they are an artist with all manners of fiber: optical, myomer, carbon, dietary. And alongside them, we also welcome the newly acquired bondsperson, William Becker, who will be tasked to study diligently and master these fibrous arts. Together, they will help lead the clan to a long, stringy future. Some of you have expressed concerns that this has little to do with our clan's founding principles, but our ever-esteemed Loremaster, RetroLazer, assures me that this work helps bring us closer to the Kodama we so honor, as I knew it would all along. So take heart, and do your best this month to embody those most distinguished Kodama traits. Be lithe, slender, filamentous, and capable of being spun into yarn.
Primary objective. Podcast topic segment. Initiating.
Hello, sensual listeners, and welcome to another installment of BungleTech. I'm your co-host, Michael, and I am not joined by my host, Nathan, this month. Instead, I am joined by a longtime friend, first-time guest, Paul, the demo agent. How are you doing, Paul?
Doing great for a Friday night, Michael.
We made it through another week, we crawled over the finish line, and now we're here to enjoy some BungleTech.
Well, and how could I not enjoy hanging out with the bodacious Michael on a Friday night?
I'm bodacious. I don't think Nathan's ever used that on me.
Well, you know, we've thrown down the gauntlet for Nathan to come up with more than just sensual, and there's so many terms that are great, and so I thought I'd kick that off.
All right. I guess Nathan's on notice once he listens to this episode. Step up your act, Nathan. Anyways, okay. So this month we wanted to talk a little bit about the new player experience and the experience of being with new players. So just to sort of get us started a bit, Paul, who the heck are you?
So my name's Paul. My online handle that some people may know me by is Lorian Sunrider. I've been around in the BattleTech community for a lot longer than I'd like to think about nowadays, but I originally got back in when Mech Commander was new in the 90s, and then I've kind of tried to stick in the community and through its various formats throughout the years, and all the way through up to where we are now. And the past 5 or 6 years, I've been a demo agent for Catalyst, largely trying to teach new players the game and bring existing players what they want, which seems to be largely campaign play.
And so, you know, you mentioned Mech Commander, but when we were sort of talking the other day, You still feel that you're sort of a tabletop focused guy.
Yeah, I mean, I've played a lot of the games extensively, but there's something about the on the table experience that even in tools like MegaMech, I just find are great. But there's something about standing around the table and rolling those dice and laughing about the results or cursing your dice that is just a completely different experience that you can't really replicate even through video games. That being said, I still have an inordinate amount of time and stuff like MechWarrior Online with friends and whatnot, but tabletop is still the primary goal of my BattleTech experience.
And you sort of you want to bring that to new people. Share the love.
I think there's always more people that can be introduced to BattleTech, and I think it's a game that's more and more accessible than it's ever been. So, and I think we'll probably dive into that a little bit. But
yeah.
Bit of history. For those of us that may not know, Michael and I did know each other for a long, long time, and BattleTech actually brought us back together. We went to high school together, and we were acquaintances, ran into some of the same circles, even friendly, I dare say, even if we wouldn't call each other besties or anything like that. And then, call it almost 15 years later, we ran into each other at Gamescom Canada and sat down at the table, and we recognized each other. So that was kind of a funny experience from a BattleTech perspective to bring back old friends, as it were.
Yeah, it was extremely surreal. Especially because you listened to the podcast. You didn't know it was me. Well, you knew it was me, but you didn't know that me was the younger me.
The voice seemed familiar, and that as Nate puts it, the sensuality was obviously appealing enough to keep me around without even knowing that connection. And then it was funny, shortly thereafter, Nate was participating in the Kickstarter launch party that Calgary was lucky enough to get to hold for the Mercs Kickstarter. And we spent all day together playing and chatting. And then the next morning, we both show up at the same How to Help Your Babies Learn Sign Language class. Literally the next morning, be like the Spider-Man meme of like, what are you doing here? Who are you? So it's been a funny kind of experience getting to know Nate and then reacquainting myself with you, but I wouldn't take it any other way.
Yeah, it's a small world, and BattleTech brought us back together. And I guess, sort of talking about like the fun of standing around the tabletop, that's something that wouldn't have happened in any other medium. If we'd landed in the same MechWarrior Online lobby, you would never have recognized me.
I mean, eventually the voice might have gotten to me maybe, but yeah, there's a very strong probability we could have played together for years and I would have had no idea.
So when we first re-encountered, that was actually at sort of like basically like an intro session, right? Like I remember there was it was my first time going to sort of an event like that. Catalyst had a corner, big area for their different things, and there was, I guess, this like long running grinder that was just there, and I got plopped into, handed. I don't even remember what kind of a mech I was handed, but it was. Even as someone who like knew the rules of the game, it was kind of weird just dropping into that.
I mean, and that's kind of the things with conventions is you kind of just roll with the punches in a lot of ways, but definitely was interesting because I think if memory serves, that was the first time both as demo agents and even Catalyst was running a grinder event called Raise the Flag. So there was kind of a thematic faction warfare going on, but it was like 2v2v2v2v2. And so you kind of jumped in with a random guy you didn't even know, and Nate jumped in with somebody else, and there was chaos and confusion.
I still have my little House Lao badge that I got to put on my attendee badge.
Oh man, that's kind of telling that you would keep a Liao badge, but the brainwashing obviously worked.
So you said that's sort of the first one. Tell me a little bit about like what kinds of events you've usually been involved in.
So as mentioned, we did the Mercenaries Kickstarter for the Calgary launch party. That was really cool. Not a perfect event by any stretch of the imagination, but that was kind of my baptism by fire as a demo agent, because prior to that, COVID had kind of made a lot of things tricky. So I'd done a few events here and there with some of the more senior agents, but that was kind of my first real one. And that was a full weekend event that was essentially a different scoring grinder with a bunch of random mechs, and players were trying to achieve the highest scores possible in, I think it was 3-hour sessions or something like that. So that was a lot of chaotic fun. But otherwise, it's been trying to attend things like Gamescom Canada, and they try to run a certain variety of events, whether they be narrative, feature events, or grinders are quite common. But where the niche that I've kind of found was teaching new players. So there's a lot of what they call the BattleTech boot camp setups at conventions, and then I've tried to take those same lessons and make myself available for new players, whether it be at just the average game shop, like our local shops at Ogreston or Under the Mountain, and try to be available to teach players that are either new players or returning players, because it's actually rather surprising how many returning players you come back and it's the usual, oh, I haven't played since the 90s, what's different? And it's like, well, I can help walk you through that, but not a whole lot, it turns out.
It's things change gradually, you know. The wars in BattleTech are measured in decades, not
War never changes, Michael.
Space war with robots never changes.
Well, I mean, I would like to argue that it never changes, and then Nate came along and introduced strip tech rules, so
yeah,
I'm not sure if that's entirely accurate anymore, but there you go. BungleTech, changing warfare forever.
Nathan is making the world he wants to live in.
If that's not terrifying, I don't know what is.
He's actualizing. Okay, so you sort of, you know, you work as a demo agent. You also spend a lot of time outside of the demo thing. You're a self-proclaimed expert at teaching new players BungleTech, BattleTech. I assume you also tell them about BungleTech, you know, part and parcel.
For the most part, it's got to have a certain breed to appreciate the mystique, shall we call it? No, I mean, in a lot of ways, the joke I always tell people is I'm not the best BattleTech player. I'm not the best rule guy. I've got a lot of the rules on my head, but I'm still going to make mistakes and I don't know everything. Mm-hmm. But I think I have a lot of patience and a lot of enthusiasm that hopefully doesn't come across as overbearing to be able to help introduce people and kind of catch that initial itch of, oh yeah, this is kind of fun. Mm-hmm. So if that makes me an expert, sure, but I always hesitate to call myself an expert in anything.
Modest, just like me.
Somebody's got to be modest with Nate around,
yeah,
right?
Know, we got a buddy cop thing going.
The good cop, slightly gooder cop.
The cop who knows the rules and the cop who makes it up as he goes along.
You're off the case.
There have been some games you've played with Nathan, so there have definitely been some games where you really wish you could just say, Nathan, turn in your Jenner. You're off the game. We need to go home. It's 11 o'clock.
For any longtime listeners that have heard Michael and Nate talk about perhaps not using arrow 4 and double blind rules, that was my very first game with Michael and Nate in my basement, and they tried to eliminate me turn like 4 in a light mech getting hit by arrow 4. So of course I've always got to give them a hard time about that, because at the time I'm probably a little grumpy, but in hindsight it's a hilarious moment.
Yeah,
that's BattleTech for me. It's all those hilarious moments that you'll be able to laugh about forever. Mm-hmm. So,
and so when you're playing with new players, you know, I guess that's sort of like the spirit that you try to get across to them.
Yeah, I mean, for me, BattleTech at its core, you can play it as a competitive game. And I'm not saying you ever advocate playing stupid, because that's just going to frustrate some opponents either. But if you see something, you can push your advantage, push your luck, and go for that rule of cool. I'm not saying do a DFA every opportunity you get, but if you're in a situation where, you know, it's looking pretty grim, might as well throw the Hail Mary, absolutely go for that cool moment. Mm-hmm. And I think as a teacher, it's always interesting because, of course, new players are often listening to what advice you give them. So I try to give a new player like 2 or 3 options saying, you know, you could go rather aggressive, you could be more defensive, or you can always just stand and shoot me, and chances are you'll get a better shot on me, that sort of thing. But as the person then playing the opposite side, it's usually playing suboptimally because you're not trying to actually beat somebody in the first game. It's trying to give them every opportunity to make that memorable moment where they manage to blow your leg off or something like that.
Yeah.
But it's got to be said that sometimes it's pretty funny when, you know, you're playing with this 8-year-old kid, you're giving him every possible tactical advantage, and he's missing every dice roll, needing 5s. Sometimes the game just says no, but you just got to be able to roll with it and laugh and hopefully teach them the amusing side of it as well, and that frustration.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's a good way to put it, but
Yeah.
sometimes it's easier with people than the 8-year-olds, but sometimes you also fudge the dice rolls a little bit.
So there's sort of a couple things in there I wanted to ask about, but one of them is, you know, you mentioned like, you know, playing suboptimally, and to me, like, and this probably comes across in like a lot of the conversations that Nathan and I have had, you know, I feel like BattleTech is a game where optimal play can vary a lot depending on sort of what it is you want to take out of the game. You know, for Nathan, he's like super narratively driven. So for him, doing something that is cool or something that his pilot would do, that is optimal play for his character. You know, whereas for other players, you know, it's finding like mechanical optimality and squeezing every, you know, every advantage out of every move. So it feels to me like there'd be a lot of leeway when you're playing BattleTech to, you know, try to win, be a scary opponent without like lording your rules mastery over them.
I mean, to me, it's all about what's enjoyable too. Like there was a recent event hosted by the Council of Jeffs locally, who I know Nate has mentioned in past episodes as running local events. And it was a Trial of Blood named, and I was against a player where we both had almost identical Mad Cats. I had a slightly better range profile than he did, but he had a better ability to just sit still and soak damage. And we could have sat still 10 hexes apart, me shooting on 7s, him shooting on 9s, until one of us got lucky. But that sort of thing, it can be fun, but that's not where I find my enjoyment. So even though it was not the optimal play, I absolutely charged into short range and got my ass handed to me as a result. But I would rather do that myself. Not every time, maybe, but the majority of time I find more enjoyment in that kind of gameplay than the desperation for the win, I guess. But it's funny because, I mean, you've seen it in our group, and even at times when we play versus when we have some of the guys who are more veterans that are more used to that competitive gaming scene, their emphasis is more different and not necessarily going to match with every single player. But I think there's enough people that play the game different ways, looking at you with your blackjacks, but that doesn't necessarily make it bad. It's just different. And I'm sure there's always going to be disagreements at the table, but as long as everybody's having fun in the end and nobody's feeling like they're cheated out of a good experience, I think BattleTech lends itself well to a variety of gameplay types.
Yeah. And so then the other thing, going back to, you know, teaching 8-year-olds, and, you know, BattleTech is sometimes a game about being really unlucky. Sometimes it's like protracted, chronic unluckiness as you miss your rolls over and over again. Sometimes it's really acute unluckiness when you just die. How do new players usually take that?
I mean, it's a mixed bag. I think it depends largely on the individual, but for the most part, as long as you're like having a cool narrative moment of it, like, again, going back to that 8-year-old example, I distinctly remember there was one kid, I think he's maybe closer to 10 or 12, so a little bit closer to understanding some of the nuances of, call it, variability with dice rolls and stuff, and his dice were just not having a good time. And then he gets headshot and knocked unconscious on the first consciousness check. So he failed the roll from needing the 3. And he was a little disheartened at first, to say the least. But then the amusing thing was that I managed to overheat and shut down needing a 4, fell down in front of him. He managed to wake up first and then kicked my head in. So I think it's kind of rolling with the punches. You can always... I wouldn't say that I would throw the game at that point, but if there's a player who's clearly struggling, I'd try to come up with some sort of reason that I'm not pushing my advantage. And for the most part, they understand that from a teaching perspective that I'm not trying to beat them. But on the other hand, there's also been times where those 8-year-olds are legitimately kicking my ass, and I wish I had an excuse of bad dice or something. It's like, no, I just got outplayed by an 8-year-old. This is BattleTech. It happens sometimes.
Yeah, this is BattleTech. This is what you're signing yourselves up for, kids. Keep playing. Sometimes you'll have good games. Sometimes your opponent will have good games.
For me, all I can think about is I've got a toddler at home right now, and I just can't wait to get her playing BattleTech with me. She helps roll dice sometimes, and that's the extent of it thus far. But I'm both looking forward to playing with her, but not at the same time, because if she starts beating me consistently, I'm not sure my pride can handle that. But that's where something like Aces is exciting, because then she doesn't have to beat me up. We're beating up the AI together.
Yeah. I mean, if you start them young, that's the way to get a true BattleTech master.
Oh, so I'm not raising, some inner sphere free birth, but I'm raising an actual genuine clan warrior here where they've been trained since birth.
I assume mastery of BattleTech is similar to like being like a virtuoso pianist or a Formula One driver, where like if you're not, playing at the fourth grade or winning your local go-kart cup by like age 7, you're basically destined to just be a mediocre player like me or you for the rest of our lives.
We're Salama from the get-go. I'm okay with that. I've never been the most competitive individual. Managed to grow out of that quite young, and thankfully, which I think personally means that in war games and board games, it's just more enjoyable if you can roll with it.
Yeah.
But
So sort of on the talk of like, games and game types and games where you can really roll with it, I'm glad Nathan isn't here to talk about grinders. Nathan, famous card carrying grinder hater, you have
not the
probably
app.
run in more grinders than any of us, probably more than most listeners. How cool are grinders? How do they work?
So, for those that are unfamiliar, grinders essentially are a free-for-all, almost Solaris-esque game where players are randomly assigned a mech, usually via a roll of a dice, sometimes via drawing a deck from a card, or even just blind drawing from a pile of record sheets. And then you plop down on a map with all the other people playing, and it's a complete and utter free-for-all. And every time you die, you just immediately spawn in a new mech. And in most grinders, you're usually spawning into a slightly better mech every time you die. And sometimes there is scoring and rewards if you get more kills and whatnot, but the general theme is get in there, push your luck, be risky, because if you die, the reward is you get a better mech. And then you can avenge yourself against the person that just blew you up. So most of the time you're starting in a light mech and working your way up to an assault. So you die in your locust to Nate and his Jenner, but then you show up with a hunchback and you spawn right behind Nate while he's busy dealing with Michael and his blackjack. It leads to some pretty cinematic moments and some pretty good laughs around the table usually.
But not for Nathan. Nathan doesn't laugh at grinders. He's miserable the whole time.
You say that, but going back, the first time that I really got in any sort of games with Nate was the launch party for the Kickstarter, and that was effectively a grinder. And all I'll ever remember is Nate running around in a Jenner, go figure, DFAing 4 turns in a row and somehow not dying. It was just...
Didn't suffer legs explode.
Somehow he kept going down to like 1 crit slot in each leg without it dying. So, and the other mechs just were whiffing, trying to blow him out of the air. But it's funny that even the professed hater, which I can understand, it's not for everybody because Nate is all about the narrative gameplay and building a story. Sometimes it's a little too chaotic to build a proper story when your character only lasts 3 or 4 turns. But yeah,
are they usually used for like new players? You mentioned the launch party, but I assume that was probably a lot of like reasonably experienced players. I know when I played the grinder, that was mostly people who had played before. I think the sort of like new player tutelage was going on in a different area. Are grinders really like a new player thing? Are they an intermediate player thing? Are they just a con thing?
I think they kind of started as a con thing, but it's kind of a universal appeal because it's something that more experienced players, maybe it's not the competitive game they're looking for, but it's still an excuse to hang out and throw dice and have fun and make those memories. And in my experience, at least with cons, there's usually, as I mentioned, the boot camps that start players out literally walking them through turn by turn, each individual phase, movement, firing, physicals, all those things. But quite often it's not, or I should say it's not uncommon that all of our boot camp tables are set up and busy mid demonstrations for players, but we have space at the grinder table and we say, hey, if you don't want to wait, go sit at the grinder table. Chances are the agent running can totally help you get up to speed quickly, and the other players at the table, since it's a just for fun event, will absolutely help you out most of the time too. Again, not a universal, but I don't think I've ever seen a grinder table sit down where a new player's like, hey, I've never played before, and anybody's like rolling their eyes or anything. It's like, oh, hey, awesome. Let's get you a mech. Let's get you blowing stuff up. Let's go. We'll walk you through it. And if you need advice, we're happy. But if you want to just play and figure it out as you go, that's totally fine too.
Have you ever seen all the experienced players gang up on the new player?
Only once, and that was deliberately the new player was trying to bait them because his mech was borderline crippled. And he was like, come and get me. You guys clearly don't know what you're doing. You guys suck at this game. Like, he was deliberately hamming it up, and everybody understood that.
Strategist. Yeah. All part of his plan to get the biggest mech on the table.
Well, I think his commando that was down to one leg and no arms and breached in basically every torso, I think combined it we did was over 250 points of damage between multiple Gauss rifles, large pulse lasers, and even a double tapped Ultra 20. Yeah, so ganged up on, yes. Completely asking for it, also yes.
I mean, if you handed me a commando, I would probably start trying to kamikaze it right away. So, you know, I understand
that would explain
Nate
and his Jenners, I guess, but I think that's also just a little bit of Nate's play style, though. But yeah, so kind of go back to the original question. Grinders started as that con thing and that kind of universal in and out. And honestly, at a convention too, the ability for somebody to kind of drop out as like, say, all right, my mech died, I'm going to back out. It doesn't actually affect the balance of the table if a mech doesn't respawn in, sort of thing. It gives that ability, which is really nice, because I don't know about your experience at conventions. I always found it kind of daunting that it'd be like, all right, I'm booking this event and it's a time slot for 6 hours, and that's what I'm doing for 6 hours. And I'm potentially not going to get to see half the convention because of it.
Yeah.
As awesome as some of those things are, I know Catalyst, for example, has a lot of Shadowrun stuff that where they've got one-off missions and stuff like that. I know people that absolutely love that. But for me, I'm the kind of person that loves exploring everything a convention has to offer. So for somebody to be able to walk by, play for an hour or whatever, and be able to pop out without any consequences of, like, quote unquote bailing on his teammates or anything like that, it's a really nice touch.
Yeah. I tend to be like a very chill con goer. You know, I've always been aware, even when I was like really into role playing games, I'd always be aware of, like, you know, those, you know, sign up and you know, play a session of some role playing game, play a session of Shadowrun, and I've known about those, but I have never signed up because I don't know, my con experience is usually just like chilling, wandering around, looking at things, talking to people. And yeah, you know, like the Gamescom Canada was the first time I'd seen a Catalyst table. And yeah, it was super chill. You know, it was a little bit intimidating, you know, coming over because there was this, you know, giant big quadruple table with a bunch of mechs and like 6 people seated around it. But you know, they were super chill and, you know, dropped in, and because of the like game was quite straightforward, and, you know, balance and winning and tactics weren't that big of a thing. You know, I just dropped in, I took over someone else's mech and started rolling dice, and it moved along at a pretty good clip.
Also, you know that guy over there with the beard? That's the guy that, like, the line dev, so don't embarrass yourself in front of him.
I would never.
Which is funny considering that now you've interviewed Randall, and that was probably the first time, not that you truly met him, but I think that was when Nate kind of first met him, so to speak, and then followed up in the future after that. But it's just kind of funny that at the time, I don't think you would have ever envisioned going to that con and sitting at that table would lead to interviewing them in the podcast probably a year or so later when he was coming back through town, right? So it's just kind of funny how things have evolved from there.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know. It's running events is super cool. And it seems to be kind of like a big thing these days. I don't travel a lot for events or anything, but um, you know, getting people into the game is obviously like a big push for Catalyst right now. And, sort of in your experience over the past few years, what is it that has been bringing new people into BattleTech? You know, things seem to be going well right now. What is it that you think is driving that?
I think one of the easy answers is the updated miniatures. I think in a lot of ways, as somebody that owns a lot of old minis, a lot of pewter, a lot of the old, even cheaper plastic ones that Catalyst was putting out in the mid 2000s after Clicky Tech,
Hmm.
the updated visuals just makes it such more an easy sell and eye grabbing feature at the wall of your local game store than it was for a long time. And even as silly as it sounds, I'll never forget walking into that convention hall for the first time and seeing the giant BattleTech banners that are probably like 80 feet long by 40 feet wide. There's nothing quite like that. Giant robots has always been a weakness. I don't know if that spawns from even Star Wars or where that originally comes from for me as a kid. But there's something about that. Again, the rule of cool and giant robots beating each other up is always going to be cool. So having the updated art style that isn't just homage to the 90s and I guess the late 80s goes a long way. But I think it's just one of a couple different ways. I think we're kind of in a golden age of a lot of ways where there's almost more BattleTech than you can keep up with. As somebody that tries to, there's more fiction than I can read, and I say that as somebody that reads really fast. It just comes out faster than there's free time. There's more miniatures than I can paint to keep up with and as they come out, which is probably more of a personal flaw than an actual statement, probably. But just there's so many draws. There's new rule books, there's new box sets, there's new formats of the game, whether it be grinders or Alpha Strike or even the reintroduction of stuff like the more universal scale stuff with Battle Force and whatnot. There's basically something for everyone, and all of them are seemingly getting at least some attention. I mean, a Catalyst can't develop every facet of the hobby, but for where they can't, there's other people stepping up, whether it be like you and Nate developing all of your game modes. It's not that there weren't other game modes out there, but you guys honed your craft and developed a really cool bundle of games that I've had the pleasure of playing a lot
Would you consider this craft? We're doing something.
Well, okay, but let's put it this way. As I kind of said to Nate the other day, it's always amazing to me to see how far BungleTech's come as both a fan and a friend of the show, in the sense that I've seen what Nate started with in terms of like the graphics that he would use for the community drive with all the different game modes in them, to seeing where things have evolved to with the global campaign initiative. It's a night and day difference. And I think, well, I would absolutely argue it's unique with the depth and the scope of what you guys are doing with the global campaign initiative. There's lots of people out there doing really cool projects too, whether it be the hired steel guys that you guys have interviewed, or people making these really cool mods for the video games, or coming up with their own custom TROs, like the fan TROs. There's some amazing work in some of those. It's not necessarily always my cup of tea, but I can absolutely appreciate that all of it exists. And again, I can't ever keep up with it all, even as much as I want, which it's funny as a demo agent, feeling like you can have new players come up that have only been in the game for, a couple months, be like, oh yeah, I heard about this. And it's like, wait, what now?
They're supposed to tell me first.
Wow. I don't know if I'm quite that lucky, especially because I think the community is such a large driving factor. Catalyst has also obviously done their best over the years, especially in the past, call it 5 to 10 years, to bring BattleTech back into the bright lights, as it were. But for a long time, the community is what kept BattleTech alive. And I know Randall said as much when he was interviewed by you guys. Everybody that you've talked to, whether it be Tex, whoever, the community is what drives BattleTech forward and keeps it thriving. And I think we're so lucky that I know people that play exclusively aerospace rules, and they still find people to play with. That wasn't always a thing. And not every game mode is that lucky. Like, I think there's plenty of other war games and tabletop games where people have invested a lot of time and money, even to say X-Wing. Like, well, that was massive there for a while, and there's still a following.
Yep.
But it's largely community keeping that sort of thing alive. And I think BattleTech has been lucky enough, for especially for a game of its longevity, to have community carrying the torch as long as they have, and then helping feed the fire, as it were, now.
Yeah.
So there's lots of hooks, whether it be the community initiatives, all the product Catalyst is putting out, and just it's extra cool looking.
And
you can't beat the rule of cool.
And we've talked to like a bunch of people, and BattleTech is like it's sort of like you said, it's something for everyone. It's really like quite a broad property that we've got. Probably, there's I would wager that there are probably lots of people who you intro to the tabletop who have played many hours of video games in the BattleTech universe, but never touched tabletop.
Or conversely, people have put a lot of time and effort into things like the Global Campaign Initiative, a really cool podcast, lots of cool game modes, and even has played, a fair amount of the tabletop game and even some RPG stuff, and has borrowed a fiction book that I'm pretty sure he's still not open, Michael, because I think I lent you Decision at Thunder Rift 2 years ago. And has it been cracked yet, Michael? But again, that's the point. Like, you've done so much and participated in so much with BattleTech, and yet there's still one of like the pillars of BattleTech's history that you've never even had the chance or the time. I don't know about lack of desire. I can't speak for you on that, but there's so much to the game, and you've not even touched one of like tens of thousands of pages of the fiction, if not hundreds of thousands of pages at this point, between the novels, the source books, all those. Like, there's so much that you could dive into and still never touch every corner of the game. And to me, that is such a cool thing, that you can play this game for decades and want to try everything, and yet there'll always be something to surprise you.
Yeah, so I guess maybe on pivoting a little bit, there always being something more to do. What is it that you would like to do more of? Specifically maybe around like tabletop gameplay. What are you lacking in your hundreds, thousands of hours of tabletop gameplay?
Oh, that's a tough one. I think there's always definitely things that players want to explore more. I think a universal answer amongst almost any BattleTech player, but I shouldn't say any, but a majority, is the narrative focus of campaigns, especially if it's got like some RPG elements. Not everybody's into the role-playing side of things, but for me, that was one of my favorite experiences ever with BattleTech. Was during COVID, was an online RPG where Destiny was rather new at the time, and we were using that as our core rule set, and then playing the actual combat out with Mech. To me, that'll probably be like my peak BattleTech moment that I may never be able to top, just because COVID gave us nothing else to do. So we could role play characters on Discord for 8 hours a day, and we weren't missing out on the rest of life. But I mean, Alpha Strike for me is a really cool game type, or format, I guess is probably the better way to put it. And I've probably got a couple dozen games under my belt at this point, but there's so much depth and complexity to there. Maybe not to the same level as if you were playing with the BungleTech crowd and all the TAC Ops rules, but there is depth there, and there's a lot of game and meat there that people get a ton of enjoyment out of. And I would love to have the opportunity to field those larger armies more, and get the motivation to keep painting more. But at the same point in time, it's super appealing. Like, I think it was my first or second game of Alpha Strike. We did a company on company in an hour and a half, and we talked a lot. Like, we were distracted. That was not a focused, laser efficient game by any stretch of the imagination. But the idea of a BattleTech game that doesn't take multiple hours, as enjoyable as that is, as a parent now with other obligations and other responsibilities, sometimes quick is nice too.
Yes. I will say, I have lived that very much to an extreme. When I think about a game of BattleTech, I think about like 10 to 14 hours of grueling analytical advanced rules play. So the idea of potentially playing a game in even single digit hours, that there is a real appeal to that.
How much of that is rule checking though? Because we have people at our table go, well, hang on. That's not what Nate did last time. No, I digress. I'm just taking the Mickey out on Nate. He's obviously he loves his advanced rules and they're always a lot of fun. But
if Nathan didn't want us to just flag him the entire time, he should have been here. This is on him.
He's on an envoy mission to California and to learn more about the BattleTech community there. He's just on a BungleTech field trip. He'll come back with so much content and wisdom from a new community. That's what it is, right?
My mentor isn't here. I'm upset and I'm taking it out on him. I'm mad and I want him to know it.
I'm really struggling with the idea that you refer to Nate as your mentor.
I mean, technically, he introduced me to the game.
You're not wrong, but just you're like the more, I don't want to say that Nate's not responsible, but you come across as the more calm, collected than Nate's the firecracker that's racing from one cool idea to the next time. So the idea that your mentor is the squirrel on cocaine sometimes, and I say that with all love in my heart, I adore Nate, is just an amusing mental image, I suppose.
Yeah. It's been an interesting journey to here. I wonder what would my life be like if Nathan had never forced me to play BattleTech with half remembered rules. I don't know if I ever would have ended up at a grinder table with, honestly, that was one of the worst parts was showing up, and the first time I tried to do something using what I thought was a rule, but turns out was actually an advanced rule and was not in play, and I felt silly. No one at the table said anything other than, "Oh, that's an advanced rule. You don't do that." But still, I felt profoundly embarrassed, and I've never forgiven Nathan for teaching me that
here. I mean, but some of that is house rules too. I mean, that invariably happens with BattleTech. There's so many things that have been house ruled over the years that, as Keith Hahn, when he was on, talked about in the Battle Mech manual, that was half the inspiration for the common misconceptions was the house rules or misunderstood rules. So I think the fact that you're busting out an advanced rule is probably more favorably viewed by veteran players than just wrong or a house rule that is not actually a rule. But what do I know? I've probably done the same thing without realizing it. So
something else I'm curious about. I know we're sort of closing out here, but how important is it at an event to follow the rules?
That's a really good question. I think ultimately it's important, but it shouldn't always be the hill to die on. I mean, even you and I have participated in games where it's agreed upon, hey, we're not going to agree what's necessarily the right interpretation of this rule. We're going to come to an agreement today. We're going to play it that way today. We'll revisit it tomorrow. I think that can happen at any table. Conventions and whatnot, or even teaching sessions, I always try to play the rules because you never want to make another player feel cheated because somebody else isn't following the rules. That's always a bad feeling. I think there's always people that would be willing to mulligan or kind of let
things slide,
nudge the rules, but let it slide is a good way to put it, but not necessarily outright breaking the rules. I think as soon as you start breaking some of the core rules of the game, it falls apart and a lot of the things lose their meaning. Like it doesn't really matter if somebody gets that through armor critical, but they cock a dice and re-roll both instead of one, or some combination there of whatever the table deems as the appropriate rule. It just doesn't feel good if somebody feels like they're on the losing end of a rule not being followed.
Yeah, definitely.
I think there always has to be the wiggle room, especially for new players. Be like, hey, that maybe wasn't optimal or that's some bad luck, but I think a lot of players will roll with it. It's just making sure that nobody is left feeling like they're the ones holding the bag.
And I think in general, BattleTech players are pretty good about that. I mean, there's lots of people who are competitive, and if you're playing a competitive environment, it's totally different. But a lot of BattleTech is pretty casual, and the people are generally like they're cool about it. Um, we're all here to have fun. Sometimes you explode. Sometimes you let things slide a little bit. Sometimes you maybe, like you say, you don't press your advantages all that if the battle's swinging really heavily. You know, that's fine.
It's funny you say that because I kind of had the opposite end of the spectrum experience not that long ago. I guess it was last summer. Jesus, already. I was participating in Renegade HPG. They were doing a BattleTech card game tournament with like sealed decks, and so the appeal to me as a relatively new player that Nate had dragged into the card game was everybody got random booster draws, essentially, not dissimilar to what people do with Magic tournaments and stuff, where you just get random boosters and you have to build your cards from that. So for me, that was appealing going in from a perspective of a new player that's like, okay, this is people not playing with decks they've been honing since 1995. So that I have something of a chance. But there was still kind of, every player I played with was great, don't get me wrong, but there was very clearly the people that were much more willing to be like, hey, you did that wrong, can you fix it, versus, hey, are you trying to cheat? It's like, no, just a new player, sorry. So
yeah, but those are card game players.
They're edge case even for BattleTech, huh?
No disrespect, but when you're a card game player, I mean, you're built different. Like, I've played some Magic the Gathering. I've played some BattleTech trading card game at gunpoint by Nathan. And yeah, and I don't know. Card game players are built different. You gotta be a different beast to thrive in that kind of an ecosystem.
I'll admit there's definitely a different competitive edge amongst card players than the average BattleTech player. That being said, there are still the competitive BattleTech players. I will absolutely own up to that. I just think that even by the average war game standard, given that BattleTech is not inherently a competitive game, it helps the overall mood a lot.
Yeah. We love each other. Most of us.
We love to beat each other up. Virtually / spiritually, I guess.
And
not
beat
literally.
up. That's one of the key parts. We like also when our own mechs explode.
So we're masochists and sadists. Got it.
All right. Well, was there anything else you wanted to add, Paul?
Not that I can think of, Michael. There's always something to chat about with BattleTech, as you and I have waffled for hours before, but I think largely the core experience for new players is always been a welcoming one, and I hope that continues in our community. And hopefully we can all play our part to do that, because the best way for BattleTech to keep growing is to bring in new blood. Eventually we'll get tired of playing with each other, so we need new people to play against.
Paul says, find an 8-year-old, beat them at BattleTech.
I am the greatest.
Prove your superiority over new players by thrashing them awfully.
And if they come back for more, well,
then they belong
They're
here.
built different.
All right. Well, thanks so much, Paul. And thanks so much for talking about that. We'll be back in a little bit talking about some rule mistakes. But for now, on to the next segment.
Thanks for having me.
This is Professor Michael presenting The Sphere We Live In. Historically, electronic countermeasures have operated under a variety of different classifications and modalities, such as IR reflectors, laser spoofers, jammers, blip enhancers, pseudo-chaff launchers, and active camouflage. Most of these see limited use on the modern battlefield due to Star League technological convergence and the eventual ubiquity of current ECM and ECCM systems. The Star League's initial development of the Beagle Active Probe with its redundant multimodal sensor arrays and comprehensive data analysis subprocessors rendered nearly all existing ECM systems moot, and left most conventional approaches as dead ends. It was also the Star League that developed countermeasures to the Beagle, with the Guardian ECM system, an advanced, targeted, active module that could analyze incoming EM signals and fire directed electromagnetic pulses to jam, overwhelm, or fry operating sensors, effectively jamming systems like the Beagle while leaving the EM spectrum clear for nearby Allied units. During periods where the Beagle active probe has been widely available, it has generally rendered all other ECM technologies obsolete, leaving the Guardian ECM and its successors as one of the only effective approaches to electronic warfare on the modern battlefield. Now you know about the sphere we live in.
Tertiary Objective Battlefield Outcome Report segment. Initiating.
Professor Michael, I finally did it. I did as you suggested and booked passage aboard a Sea Fox vessel. I spent time with what many of the clans consider to be lower caste members, such as the technician staff. At first, they were rather abrasive and had no interest in speaking with me. But persistence and time, and perhaps a little bit of boredom during a long voyage, finally won them over in the end. I began to exchange stories from my thesis studies, and in turn began to hear stories and legends from clan culture. It's utterly fascinating to hear more about clan society from an oral history perspective, and I digress. Ultimately, I wanted to communicate that after many discussions and swapping of stories involving technological oddities, I found something truly unique. One technician shared with me battle ROM footage allegedly recovered from a fallen bandit caste warrior. The footage shows a Shadowcat jump behind a Stormcrow, unleashing a full alpha strike of its weapons into the Stormcrow's rear, only to in turn be vaporized by an explosion. At first I was skeptical that it was more than an ammo explosion gone catastrophically wrong, as the Stormcrow in question was carrying an Ultra AC-20, but upon further review of the footage, you can actually see the engine of the mech go critical. The mythical stack-pulling mech! Everyone for years has been saying it's just an old mech jock's tale, with no grounding in reality. But it's real, and here's concrete proof. Everything science tells us about fusion engines says that they shouldn't explode, especially with enough ferocity to then destroy a nearby mech. But there was legitimately only a smoking crater left of the two mechs once the smoke cleared. There's clearly more to science and technology than even we, with all of our years of progress, can fully comprehend. I'm including a copy of the battle ROM for your review, sir, and will continue to investigate any other technical anomalies I can find during this voyage. We truly live in a fascinating time in history, sir, and I cannot wait to add this to my thesis presentation. So, what happened? I was playing a game with some visiting friends from out of town, including a teenage child of one of the players. She was relatively new to BattleTech, but had some playing experience. She jumped her Shadowcat A variant behind a Stormcrow during combat, and unleashed a full alpha strike into the rear of the Stormcrow. 2 ER large lasers and a Streak 6 all hit home, including one laser critting into the side torso rear, and the other large laser hitting the center torso rear. Then she added insult to injury when 4 of the 6 Streak 6 missiles also hit the center torso in the rear, and they all crit as well. There was even a crit on some of the AC-20 ammo as part of the process. In the end, she managed a total of 7 engine hits. We explained there was an optional rule that we could use in this situation, but that might be detrimental to her own mech. Sure enough, she loved the idea and immediately rolled the dice. And the dice confirmed it. The mech exploded into a nuclear fire cloud and even managed to eviscerate and destroy her own Shadowcat in the process. At first, I was worried she wouldn't be happy with the outcome, but in true BattleTech fashion, she thought it was hilarious and immediately wanted to try and replicate the situation in the battle again. It was heartwarming that even with a relatively new player, winning and losing wasn't important, but a hilarious story to tell her friends was the best part of the game in her opinion.
This is Professor Michael presenting The Sphere We Live In. Unlike the terrifying fusion weapons of past wars, the fusion engines employed throughout the sphere are incapable of erupting with such destructive force. Many students look at the engine in their family's car, or the aerospace craft they are flying in, or at the heart of the city they live in, and they see thick casings with redundant systems surrounding the miniature star. They assume that these are to contain the violent reactions within, But in reality, the containment itself is purely magnetic, though the circuits driving the magnetic field must be reinforced themselves. Truthfully, the containment devices are mostly to protect the delicate fusion reaction from the harsh, unfriendly environment outside. The hydrogen fusion can only occur in a very narrow range of conditions, isolated in vacuum and driven to temperatures that measure millions of degrees. So during containment failure, small amounts of cold matter will immediately cool the hot hydrogen plasma and halt the reaction. There are reports of rare failures where hypervelocity weaponry has caused containment breaches while also injecting matter that is superheated by the plasma, but such an explosion would be more akin to a boiler or turbine failure, and is fundamentally not nuclear. Now you know about the sphere we live in.
Secondary objective, rule check discovery segment. Initiating.
Welcome back to our rule check discovery segment. And as with pretty much everything else this episode, it's going to be a bit different. So Paul has spent hundreds, thousands, millions of hours playing with brand new players who only have Paul's explanations to guide them through their first or second or third games of BattleTech. So what I want to know, Paul, is what mistakes have you imparted on your poor proteges?
Oh my God, when you say it like that, it literally like... There's memes of people like bent over a table sweating with like empty bottles of alcohol, and it's just like, oh God, what have I done?
How have you failed the next generation of BattleTech? How are you contributing to the future downfall of the game that we all love?
Just sitting in like this future demo agent meeting, it's like, there seems to be this common misconception going around new players. We don't understand where it's coming from. It's like, oh shit. Wait, am I allowed to swear? We probably should have covered that like before the main segment.
Generally not, but also we've never made a big deal about it. It's fine.
Fair. Yeah, so it's kind of been interesting. I definitely have been incorrect many a times, as Michael can attest. I struggle with line of sight more than anything. Anytime there's somebody standing next to a hill and there's people directly adjacent or 4 levels above them, I have to pull out the rulebook every time because I can't be trusted with those kind of line of sight questions. But I think my original rule misconception for myself was one that has been brought up before when it comes to facing an orientation after a fall. I thought when it said like 2 to the left, it'd be 2 hexes to the left. So you'd literally like slide 60 feet to the left or whatever, or 60 meters to the left, I should say.
The old classic.
Yeah, which I mean, when there's buildings there, that's kind of a problem because then that's a different can of rules. It's like, now I got to look up the rules for sub-basement check again.
And so have you imparted this on poor amateur BattleTech players?
I guarantee I tried to teach you the wrong thing with line of sight at level 2 and like directly against a hill at one point or another. So probably. The other one that always trips up both myself and other players is the firing arc versus the damage received arcs. The fact that those two are not one and the same. I wish if I could go back in time, I could mulligan that from a rules perspective. But I get it, why it makes sense, but it just overly complicates it, especially as soon as you have the defender's choice. Again, I understand why from a tactical perspective, but boy, does that make it complicated to explain to a new player. It's like, well, you have line of sight here, unless I tell you that you don't.
Yeah, I feel like I can definitely attest to that one as well, having played at a few tables with new players, and then being like, oh, so I'm shooting you in the back, right? And being like, actually, no. As you can see, damage received goes by the face of the hex, whereas firing arcs go by the lines of the hex. And they just sort of look at me and be like, well, but that's in the back.
Well, actually,
it's not really the back.
Yeah. And I mean, that I think is probably one of my favorite things I've enjoyed about Alpha Strike that I've played so far is it's not uncommon, at least in the local community, when you're moving your mech into a location, you can say to your opponent, be like, look, my intent placing this unit here is that I'll have line of sight on that unit. do you agree, especially considering an Alpha Strike, so much of it is based off the actual like 3D model perspective? I'd be like, do you agree? And given that it is usually a friendly game, you can be like, yeah, I agree. So it's not that, well, I moved here and not realizing that you're going to call the defender's choice and therefore we can't even shoot each other this round and it was just a waste of 20 minutes. To me, that's always going to be one of the biggest feel bad moments in BattleTech. So I like that Alpha Strike, at least in our local community, has found a workaround for that. I would love to find something for Classic that doesn't kind of give up the jig, as it were, because I find positioning is a bit of a slightly different beast, given that there is some more nuance, shall we say. And straight up, sometimes it's just harder to read a 2D topography map than it is a 3D terrain. Case in
And so
point.
are those kind of the areas that you see as like most troublesome for new players? The line of sight and the whole facing firing arc thing?
Yeah, I think it's definitely probably the biggest one that I run into, especially like little things like, well, you're ever so slightly clipping the corner of this hex of trees, therefore you have more than 3 hexes of trees and you can't see each other. Or, well, he's at level 3 and the trees are on level 2 and he's not directly adjacent to them. There's a lot of the little nuances that, I mean, aren't terrible to pick up, but as a first-time player, it's hard to explain, well, those trees count because they're adjacent to you, but those ones 1 hex further away don't because they're not adjacent. Some things
and technically
just aren't.
Your head is at a height of 4, so the top of the trees is only at height 2, which means you have a clear line of sight over them.
Well, and as I know has been talked about before, obviously one of the biggest rule changes was how partial cover used to work versus how it does now. I think it's a little more intuitive now in some ways, in the sense that like if you hit the legs, it just hits the ground instead. But trying to update players that haven't played in 20 years, that one still kind of can be a bit of a tricky one.
That even thinking, I've never had to play with that old rule, but it makes me mad just thinking about it. So
it was so busted. The amount of headshots was just, I mean, don't get me wrong, I'm a big fan of the defensive modifier being one of the biggest impacts in BattleTech. And that's partially why at times I kick and scream about the initiative deck and some of the effects that it has, because it completely neuters mechs that are reliant upon a good defensive modifier. I'm looking at you, Moonfog. But in that case, that's, in my opinion, a better rule for change. But again, I wasn't around for the original scene as much for that. I was a lot younger then. So, but the other interesting one that I see these days is there are obviously some differences in terms of how the to-hit numbers are calculated between Total Warfare or the Classic and how Alpha Strike's done. So the most common one is if you stand still in BattleTech, obviously it's a 0, and in Total Warfare. But in Alpha Strike, it's actually a negative modifier, because unless you're jumping, there's no modifier to movement. So it's amusing seeing players who've come in from Alpha Strike predominantly, especially there's been a larger Alpha Strike community burgeoning in Calgary lately, to see them come and try to learn Total Warfare. And it's amusing to see these common misconceptions because of this other actual legitimate rule set of BattleTech being ever so slightly different, just enough to trip up that math when trying to calculate your to-hit numbers.
Interesting.
One day we'll get you to try some Alpha Strike, Michael, and you'll learn, and it'll be just confusing as when you tried to come in with advanced rules to a basic game.
Yeah, I'd be in for some Alpha Strike.
As I was saying today, we got to do it once Aces comes out, because that'll be the good excuse, because then you guys can have the creators
Team
back
play
on that one again. So
yeah. Anything else that you usually see? Does anything stick out in your mind as like the most hilarious mistake you've ever seen a new player make? I guess like telling a player that when they fall down, their mech actually slides 60 feet on its back is kind of funny, but we already talked about that one. So are there any other ones that sort of stood out to you as particularly fun?
Technically probably not necessarily fair to said new player, but jumping into a bottomless water hex, not realizing what that meant, or jumping into water. There's a couple maps that have water that's deep enough that you can land in it and not have anywhere to actually climb out of it.
Yeah.
So
yeah,
I think in one instance, especially with the new player, we mulliganed it, but at the same point in time, it was pretty funny to be like, you know what you just did, right? You just jumped into like the swimming pool with concrete boots on and you can't get out now, right? And it's like, wait, what?
I actually have also done that. I remember doing that on an ice map with my Black Knight and being like, I'm hot. I'm going to hop into this nice cool pool to cool off and not take any fire. And so I jumped in and I couldn't take any fire and I couldn't leave.
Technically, you know, you're fine until you run out of oxygen, right? Which is longer than a game will take. So if I had to ask you, Michael, as a long-standing BattleTech podcast host of repute, what do you think is the most common rule mistake technically that players make? Putting you on the spot. I'm sorry.
Rule mistake. I mean, so the problem is the tables I'm at, when we got new players, it's usually new players being taught to play advanced rules. And I'm going to say it's not so much the advanced rules don't trip them up because BattleTech's pretty good about the advanced rules staying out of the way. And it's only when Nathan decides to pull something weird out of the book that they sort of get slapped in the face and be like, wait, you can do that? So yeah, I think like evasive. Oh no, I know the one that has friggin' been a nightmare for lots of people is linking machine guns.
Oh God, yep, fair.
Nathan loves to link machine guns and turn his you know, like 9 garbage machine guns into this weird like AC-15 analog, and just like just completely blindside some new player to be like, but I thought you were using machine guns. That says those aren't supposed to do 18 points of damage. Well, you know, I linked them, so
yeah, that's a fair one to not pull out on a new player. But so the one I was actually thinking of, which is something I'm guilty of, and pretty much every player I know of, whether they've been playing for a year, a month, 30 years in some instances, is simply the firing phase. Almost everybody plays it technically wrong by the rules, and that you're supposed to, everybody's supposed to declare fire, then you're supposed to shoot, then you all resolve damage. Like it's supposed to be, everybody makes their declarations first, and that's how people like saying, hey, you know, the target I was shooting at is now gone, ergo I don't have anything to fire at. That's a big part of where that comes from. But nobody I know, I've never actually played it that way, even at convention levels. People just roll through, this is my turn. And a lot of cases, especially in competitive scenes, people write it down even, like what their intended target is and whatnot. So if there is that, my target's been destroyed, my turn is effectively over. But nobody that I know actually plays the rule that way. And that includes playing with Keith at times, Keith Hahn from, you know, Battle Mech Manual fame. So I think it's just kind of one of those things that as the book is written, it exists for a reason, but people have just adapted to speed things up a little bit and keep things flowing a little more naturally, I suppose. But it's just kind of funny to me that you have people that can be such sticklers to the rules and almost nobody enforces that one.
Yeah. All right. Well, is there anything else you wanted to share about new player bungles? I would say that the line of sight, always tricky. Everyone bungles that sometimes. New players, you're not alone. We all bungle line of sight.
I still get mocked viciously by some of our more experienced players, and that's granted because other people I would call friends, but the fact that like, oh, look, Mr. Demo Agent doesn't know how line of sight works. And it's like, yeah, you're not wrong, but come on. Just because I can't read 2D maps.
And then firing arcs, damage arcs. I always go and I pull out the pictures from the manual that show like, these are the arcs and these are the arcs. And I always then like look at the new player sort of expectantly to see if they're like understanding. And they sort of just like get this look on my face of like, what are you talking about?
Yeah.
Why?
It's either that or a glazed look where it's like they're trying to comprehend or they don't want to comprehend because you've crossed that line past their interest threshold. Thankfully, that doesn't happen too often, but occasionally you'll be running a demo and you try to explain something like the firing arcs or torso twisting weapons and stuff, and you just get a glazed look back. It's like, oh, I lost you. Oh, you're not coming back.
Yep. And, we all do that.
Yep.
Like, everyone I've played with has mucked up either line of sight or landing in the correct firing arc to me, like, and then I hit you in the left. Actually, that's the front. Rats.
Well, I mean, let's call it spade a spade. If mistakes weren't easy to make in BattleTech, this podcast probably wouldn't exist in the format that it does. So
I find that offensive. I believe that Nathan and I are uniquely talented in our bungleness.
I won't disagree with that, because it's interesting you say that, because obviously I'm always trying to explain to people, especially friends. I had even some guests from out of town that I referenced in the Battlefield summary report. And I was trying to explain the local play groups and trying to explain how unique, in a good way, a group of games to people who only have more traditional BattleTech experiences. They're like, it can't be that varied and wacky and zany. It's like, well, you say that until you get initiative cards on top of mission objectives, and Nate's talking about satellites, and all of a sudden this advanced rule that really doesn't seem like it's that fair, but at the same point in time, there's clearly some offsets, but Nate never seems to roll the offset. It's
technically in one of the rule books.
I think the BungleTech would exist, but perhaps the core emphasis wouldn't be the Bungles, is my point I was trying to get at, I guess.
Yes, that's fair. That's fair.
I don't think anybody could truly keep Nate down if he had an inspiration.
And, I'm glad to hear the new players are also bungling, but, I'm a little bit disappointed to hear they're not, like, weirder bungles. So, listeners, if you're inspired to go out and play BattleTech, go out there and make weird mistakes. Play with Paul and show him some mistake he didn't even know was possible.
It's not impossible, but I'd like to think I've seen a lot of them, but man, that would almost be kind of impressive in its own right at this point.
That is a challenge. BungleTech Co. challenges you. Go out there, go to your local convention, find a Catalyst demo agent, ask them to teach you how to play, and make the biggest mistake you can.
I mean, one brief aside, but there is an agent locally who's been doing this for almost 30 years, and he's literally about to run his 1,000th career event as a demo agent. And he's had the good fortune to play games with Nate, and Nate has managed to surprise him. So I think that speaks to never say never. Someone will always surprise you, and it's not just Nate, I guess.
Don't just make rule mistakes. Make bungles. Make beautiful bungles in the world.
Make sensual bungles.
Make sensual bungles in the world.
Well, thank you very much, Michael. I think that's all the bungles I can think of for right now.
Yeah. All right. Thanks so much. And on to the next segment.
Members of Clan Kodama, I am Star Captain Lorian of the Raven Alliance. I am here today as special envoy on behalf of the Clan Council to investigate your clan. Rumors and hearsay have reached even the ears of the Khans, and they wish to know more about this new clan, to see if you're worthy of carrying on Kerensky's legacy. Your own Khan has been summoned to Terra to submit his case for your acceptance to the Ilkhan, while I complete my investigation of the society you have built here. Thus far, I find your dedication and skill worthy of recognition, dare I even say praise. However, whether or not you earn your place in the remembrance will be up to yourselves and your Khan. To call yourselves clan is to strive to be the very best, worthy of honor and respect. Clan Kodama may be young, but from what I have seen, there is hope for you yet.
Tertiary objective, Stories of the Inner Sphere segment. Initiating.
I didn't know there were pirates around Galatea. Or in the Old West, Johnny observed. There aren't any pirates around Galatea, Johnny, Morris patiently and clearly stated. He felt a slight tingling on the left side of his body, but it subsided when Johnny blessed Galatea with another epiphany. Then again,
This could be just the opportunity I need to build my fan base, Johnny remarked, striking a statuesque pose with a twitch of his eye and a cock of his chin. An audacious, clueless smile spread across half of the mech jock's face. Morris pinched the bridge of his nose and shook his head. God save Melissa Steiner. I need a drink and a cheeseburger. Johnny, will you pull your head out of your ass and pay attention? The Lorian frontline mech and conventional regiments are gone. Hell, Darkad's even pulled the auxiliaries up and directed them towards the Lorian Combine border. Those outback worlds are ripe pickings for hardened killers. Johnny stroked his chin. Hardened killers, you say? Johnny, these are pirates who torture captives. If they're lucky. What happens to the unlucky captives? They're ejected into space. That doesn't sound too unlucky. They're not captives then. No, Johnny, they're not captives then. They're dead. Well, I don't remember seeing that kind of stuff on the Pirates' Treasure Planet Holovids. Usually Captain Thom Scar held the Baron's daughter hostage on his Pirate Fortress asteroid, until the dashing hero, the Black Falchion, Eliak Stormhand, storms aboard and captures the pirates. Morris decided it was best to stop Johnny before he made any more of a fool of himself, though he knew Johnny would ultimately overcome his defenses through sheer force. Johnny, this isn't some fantasy where the hero swoops in, saves the girl, and gets the pirate booty. Pirate chicks are hot. Then again, so are Baron's daughters. Booty is booty, Johnny said with a guileless grin. Under the great stress of his massive frame, Morris labored to roll his chair to the bookshelves lining the back wall of the office. He grunted as he bent down and pulled a technical brief from the second shelf. Johnny, this readout has the most up-to-date technical specs on military equipment throughout the inner sphere, as of 3025. I think we need to take a look at this to see just what you're up against. Johnny adjusted his posture nervously. Books made him uncomfortable with so many words. Morris thumbed through the book with his portly hands. First, Johnny, let's take a look at your Stinger, an STG-3R. Johnny let out a sigh. He was relieved to see pictures. Notice that it's a lightweight, only 20 tons. But it's fast. And it can jump, too. Sure, it's fast. During a full run, its top speed is about 97 kilometers per hour. Yeah, just like I like my women. Small and fast. Kid, this contract isn't for the racing circuit on Solaris. You're a stopgap protection against pirate raids. The only thing stopping those murderous bandits from killing you is the 3 tons of armor spread across your entire machine. 3 tons are heavy. No, Johnny. 19 tons of Duralex heavy special armor on an Atlas AS-7D is heavy. The 3 tons of Reach 100 standard armor on your Stinger is suicidal. Johnny, if you fail to keep your piloting skills in check, you'll trip and likely blow your mech systems to hell. For Blake's sake, Johnny, your paint job gives the Stinger more protection than your armor. Well, don't forget the pinups. This has been an excerpt from Johnny Mace, Mech Ace, written by Edward N. Smith, and published in Battlecore on March 24th, 2010. And that wraps up an unusually unusual episode of BungleTech. Check out the links in the podcast description to support us on Patreon, connect with us on Discord, or just send us an email. And if you haven't had a chance to yet, drop us a review on whatever platform you are listening from. It does a ton to help people find us and pleases the mighty algorithmic gods. Thanks so much to all our patrons for their continued support, and to everyone for listening. Until next time, MechWarriors, this has been BungleTech. Selah.